Welcome to the 7th in the series of Rare Webinars. Today we'll be talking about the role of the mobile research nurses and how they have the potential to revolutionise recruitment and retention in clinical trials. I'm Nicola Miller, Creative Director at Rare Revolution magazine, and in the background working on the tech, I'm joined as always by my colleague Becky Pender. Today's session is sponsored by PCM Trials, who are striving to lead the way in mobile research. And today I'm thrilled to be joined by a really excellent panel who can help guide us through the topic. Ellen Wise, Vice President at PCM Trials, who brings nearly a decade of home visit learning to the table. Stephanie Hitchcock, also from PCM Trials, Associate Director. And Stephanie is an expert in establishing logistics and procedures for complex visit schedules and expanding the scope of what mobile visits can really entail. Melissa Irving, Chief Investigator with the NHS, who works in Clinical Genetics Department at Guy's and St Thomas's. Melissa is a Chief Investigator for a number of clinical trials in skeletal dysplasia. Hello and welcome everyone. I'm so happy to have you all here with us today. So please do turn your cameras on when you're ready. We've got a lot to get through in the next hour, so we're going to dive straight in. But before we do, just to say to our audience listening that if you've got any questions, please do type them in as we go along, and we'll endeavour to get to as many of these as we can at the end. So hi everyone, welcome and thanks for joining us. I always like to start at the beginning, so let's try and establish the what. Ellen, can you talk to us, what is a mobile research network and why is it so important?
Well, good afternoon. Good morning here from the States. Thanks very much for inviting us to participate in this very fine series, number 7, impressive. The question is, why is a mobile research nurse so important to this work that we are all endeavoring in? Well, remote visits have been around. It's 20 years this year. That is a big surprise to most folks. The very first home visit ever occurred in hemophilia, certainly a rare disease, and that was in 2003. So we're turning 20. And in those 20 years, we have seen that if we are able to go to the home or other setting where the patient is, that we are able to collect more complete data sets and probably more efficiently and faster than if we rely on that older, more established model of having patients and their families travel from home, disrupt their routines, and move to the site. So in a nutshell, that's really what we are about here, and building that complete data set is often much more efficient if we go where the data is, and that's where people are living, and that's at home.
Absolutely wonderful. And can you just flesh out, Ellen, a little bit more about the experience of PCM Trials? Obviously, you've mentioned this is something that you've been doing for kind of 15 to 20 years. Can you give us a bit more of an overview of your experience in this field?
Sure. PCM is almost as old as the industry itself. Home visits are 20 years old. We are 15 this year. So across those 15 years, of course, in the early going, this was study by study. Every IRB or EC had many, many questions, and there was a lot of resistance. But over those 15 years, in our work journey, we've completed almost 400 protocols with more than 100 sponsors around the world. And these trials have been very small in some rare and ultra rare studies, or very, very large. Everything changed in the pandemic as far as the acceptance and willingness to embrace this model. And during the pandemic, we saw the average size of our trials grow and grow and grow. So about half of the work we have done, or more than 200 protocols, does fall in the rare and orphan space, where certainly we find patients are spread every which way, irregardless of where the very fine sites may be located in the world. In fact, we have yet in our 15 years and many tens of thousands of visits found that there was a patient that lived real close to St. Thomas or across from Duke University, for instance, here in the States. We find patients in the very small towns, in the rural areas, in the empty places of very large countries. So we go where we have to.
Brilliant, thank you. And you've mentioned a little bit about the geography being a challenge, but Melita, could you expand a little bit more? I mean, obviously you see this from the side of being within the NHS and within healthcare. What are the challenges primarily for individuals and families taking part in clinical trials generally? So outside of kind of this mobile nursing, but what are the challenges that they might face aside from geography?
Well, I think it's time, really. The burden of having a rare disease upon a child is huge, and upon their family as well. I have a patient who told me the other day that last year she had 52 hospital appointments. So that's one appointment every week. And that's not a child that was on a clinical trial. So if you then include clinical trials into the mix, then that is an awful lot of time out of school, away from the community setting, away from doing things that all her peers are doing. So it really does add to the time burden. And then, of course, parents who are the breadwinners and who have to earn can't go to work. So it is a huge impact upon the whole family, just having a rare disease, and so those appointment times are really play a significant role. I think that's probably the leading thing for me.
Yeah, and that financial burden, I think, can't be underestimated, can it?
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's often overlooked, but of course, like you say, if parents are having to take time off work, or adults are having to take time off work, that's a big impact on life when they're already having to take that time off for routine appointments. So absolutely big consideration. And so, Melita, looking at it from the kind of the perspective of an investigator, how do you think these decentralized trials and mobile nursing can change that clinical trial landscape?
If we get it right, I think it will significantly change the landscape. And we're well on the road, aren't we? So which is great. So it will mean that people don't have to come up. They don't have to travel to a central place, to a big city. So I'm based in London, and lots of people don't like coming to London. Maybe once or twice, but not on a regular basis. So it's negating the need to do that. And it also means that trial activities can take place closer to home, if not in the home itself. So it causes minimal disruption to children and to their families who are taking part in trials. So I think we have to remember that it's important to collect accurate data, because we want the trials to succeed and not to fail, because we want the primary endpoints to be reached, and we want success and the benefits that will bring. So that's what I mean when I say getting it right, to make sure that we accurately collect data, we generate good clinical trial data, but we do it in a way that is much more acceptable to participants and their families.
We've learned a little bit there about what mobile research nursing is, but can we delve a little bit into why this is particularly so exciting for rare disease? Ellen, why do clinical trials in rare disease differ from other clinical trials? What are the sort of the nuances that are very unique to this population?
That's an excellent question. And from the very moment that we are contacted by a sponsor or a CRO to discuss a future trial, one of the first questions I ask is, what is the therapeutic area, the indication, and do you consider this a rare or even an ultra rare disease? Because from that moment, everything about our approach to this project takes a different road, because we understand these patients are likely to be maybe further along in a patient journey that has already been exhausting and trying and vexing to this family. We need to minimize the amount of disruption to whatever their routine may be. I don't dare to presume to call it their normal routines, because most families who struggle with rare disease aspire to use a normal routine. Their lives just don't look like everyone else's because they have so very many challenges. So these patients that we see are often fragile or immobile, or may have really disruptive psychosocial behaviors that make packing them up, dressing them up, taking them out, traveling with them and going to a site. By the time they get to Dr. Irving, these patients might be really agitated, uncomfortable, hungry, and every other kind of not able to pay attention or focus, and crying, she says, yes. So if we can manage that visit maybe before or after that child's daytime routine. Often we're requested by parents in orphan diseases with the littles, can you maybe come between dinner and bath time? Because that bedtime routine is sacred, and it has to go exactly in a certain order. And water for so many human beings, and certainly in some indications, is a real touchstone for comfort and relaxation. That if we can have them with a full belly and maybe mom and dad and all of their loved ones around. And then we're going to go into this intense activity and then have that cleansing moment of that bath time and a little exhale by our littles that says, okay, now we're back on routine. I'm in my bath. This is my happy place. So, we do try to work into the routine of the family to do this at the least disruptive and most comfortable time for patient and parents, caregivers. So the needs are greater in a rare and certainly in ultra rare disease that we understand from the moment that we begin talking. We go and do our own little research off to the side. So what are some of the markers of this indication, and what might we be expecting, and how can we be particularly and highly sensitive to what this patient and their family may be looking for from us? So
that's actually incredible to hear that you're working into that level of detail of really understanding that individual's case. I mean, that really is game changing, isn't it, to be so tailored to the individual's situation like that. And I guess as well, from a rare disease point of view, often these families are coming to you having been through a really protracted diagnostic odyssey. So the level of frustration can be generally quite high with the systems in any way. So you're already dealing with people at that kind of heightened state of frustration and perhaps a bit of discord. Is that something that you see, Melita, that there's that sort of level already within people of frustration and maybe a bit of distrust of processes?
Yes, and with trials, the last thing we want to do is annoy people and for them to say, oh, that's it, I'm not going to do this. It's just not worth the while. So to be able to do something, and that is a really impressive bespoke service that you've just described there, Ellen. I love that too. And yeah, to be able to fit into people's lives and to minimize the disruption, to really encourage them to keep taking part in the trials and get to the end. Of course, we must do everything that we can. So yeah, that does resonate with me, trying to minimize the disruption off the back of what is probably a very draining experience that they've been through already.
Yeah, absolutely. And Stephanie, can I come to you? What is the specific approach that you would take when building a clinical trial for rare disease specifically?
Sure. So when building a clinical trial for rare disease, we want to look at how we can make that burden as minimal as possible for the participant and for their family, and seeing what we could outsource to mobile visits. And so there are certain things that we look for when trying to operationalize, making sure that it's within a clinician's scope of practice that we can send into the home, making sure it's able to be done with portable equipment, and making sure that it's of an acceptable safety risk to being done in a mobile environment. So we're certainly not going to take the MRIs away from the site, but if we can do the safety laboratory draws that may be required every 2 days, if we can take that so that that can be brought to the participant, we're looking at everything that can be a little bit more flexible to ensure that participant retention and ensure that it's as easy as possible for those families.
And if we look at the sort of practicalities around that, what are the specific operational challenges for you and for the investigators when you're actually building this and actually trying to make this happen, and for the nurses?
Sure. So there are certainly some operational obstacles that we work through. Most notably, I would say adapting laboratory processing for a mobile setting is a little bit difficult. You can't bring a refrigerated centrifuge to a mobile visit. That is something that's usually about 400 pounds. And so our nurses are not carrying that into a participant's home. And so we have workarounds with that processing, and we work through that with the laboratory personnel to ensure that it's not at all compromising the data, and that it is still being processed in a manner that it won't show up to the central lab hemolyzed or anything like that, so that they can still run through that and it's not adding any additional burden on that participant.
Do you, out of interest, have any kind of feelings, is there ever a time when people say, actually, I don't want this because I don't want my home to become kind of medicalized and to become a site like that. I want that to be my safe haven. Are there families that feel very much that there is a boundary and they don't want to bring it into the home?
Yes, so I see Ellen getting certainly excited about that. And Ellen, feel free to jump in. We do certainly see some hesitation with that. And we try to really have our nurses coach to assure the participants that we are not setting up a whole clinical site in your home. We are ensuring that we are bringing exactly what we need, not more, and that we are cleaning up appropriately and making so we're not invading your space, but just facilitating having this in your home. Ellen, is there anything you would add to that?
Sure. I'll use a real world example of a trial in adolescent autism, and it required injections. And these were adolescents, which I know Dr. Irving can attest, you know, they're feeling their oats, wanting to express a little independence. And these were going to be uncomfortable injections. They were not an easy stick. And it was the request of the parents that these visits not happen at home, but perhaps at school, if at all possible, because it was at school that these children who were on a very specific and in autism, very ordered routine, it was where the children expected and had been conditioned to accept challenge. Wasn't that an interesting perspective?
Yeah.
Because that's where new foods were introduced, new ideas, new concepts, and maybe changing behavior. So let's keep home and mom and dad as a safe space. But perhaps it's at school where they had an army of aides and other kinds of support where they were expecting challenge, that we would introduce something challenging. And it sounds like such a simple idea, but it just, you know, came right at us. And parents know their kids better than anyone. So we thought that was a great suggestion, and it was practical to implement.
That's really interesting. So actually, that's an important point to bring out, that actually mobile nursing doesn't necessarily mean home nursing. There are other sites, you know, school. Does that also extend to work? Are there people that might choose to have this in the workplace to limit impact, or is that less?
To work, and you know, one that we don't see infrequently for families challenged by disease, Disney World. We can follow a family on vacation.
Seems like it would be a lot more palatable if you were at Disney World.
So at your vacation destination, when families on holiday, there's no reason that they are holidaying from their treatment path or their trials. So we're always amused and a little bit challenged by where we are asked to go. About 90% of the time it's at home, but that other 10% is office, school, vacation destination. Some families migrate away from the cold weather every winter, and we follow what we call the snowbirds.
Wow. So I guess this goes back to you, Stephanie, in terms of this logistical piece of the puzzle, and really making sure that these operational challenges can be overcome in an ever-evolving situation.
Yes, absolutely. And our project management team works closely with the sites, as well as our nurses who are working directly with those participants to ensure that we are as aware as possible of when they're planning to migrate, and so that we can be prepared and identify a clinician in that area. Certainly there are the last minute changes, and we're flexible to work with that too. Our primary goal is ensuring that we are easing the burden on these participants and these sites and bringing these visits to them. And so we will work around all the logistical challenges that we have to.
And just building on that, Melita, from a trial sponsor point of view, what can they do to help alleviate the burden on patients? You started off by talking about some of those burdens. What do you think the trial sponsors can do to help with that?
Well, thing number one is that they should engage with the people that they're trying to help right from the outset, I think, across many different levels. So I've already mentioned the primary endpoint. I think the primary endpoint can be different for clinicians, different for sponsors, different for regulators, different for families. And I think there probably is a compromise for everyone to be satisfied with what's chosen ultimately. But I think in terms of reducing that burden, increasing, improving recruitment rates and maintaining accrual, I think engaging families and people who are taking part in the trials right from the outset in designing the protocol is absolutely key. And I guess that's where you guys come in as well, because to be able to have your say and to influence the protocol, and to be able to offer what you do offer, I think would be a great improvement in how trials are run.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to come back to that a little bit later on as well. And also that this the discussion of outcomes, because I think that's a really important topic to touch on. But if we go back a little bit to that sort of success and adherence, Ellen, that you were talking about, do you feel that this model, and you've mentioned this about going into schools, maybe being something that can help with the compliance, I guess, with some of the measures, do you feel that this approach does make a difference to the success of the trial and to the adherence of these protocols?
Oh, I think very much so. I have been in and around home visits now more than a decade, which I find hard to believe. I'm half as old as our industry, and it has morphed and changed in acceptance over time. It really goes in waves. Of course, everybody got super engaged and interested in this on March 13th, 2020, when, you know, the pandemic was declared. But interest has been high really ever since. I don't think we're going to go back to what it was before, of just thinking, yeah, once in a while, why not? But I think most sponsors take into account that the patient family must be considered, because patients have a choice of whether to participate or not. Does that answer your question? Are you looking for?
Yeah, and I'd like to expand on the topic of the pandemic a little bit there. Do you think that has reframed people, you know, patients and the system's kind of appetite for this? Do you think that has made a difference and that people are thinking about this in a different way than perhaps they might have done 5 years ago?
Oh, very much so. We were always a busy place. There were a number of very forward-looking sponsors who have incorporated this into their rare disease programs from the get-go. I'm thinking of one customer in particular. We've been involved granularly on a daily basis for more than 13 years. You know, they showed that commitment early. They were joined by many, many others in 2020. We know it is a commitment to planning, to hearing the voice of the patient and their family. We also know it requires a little bit more as far as organization and monitoring and everything else. So I don't think we'll retreat back to what I call the before days, before the pandemic, but there's certainly more people interested in what we are now calling decentralized clinical trials, be it service in the home, service in the community, maybe at a chemist that's in the same small town. It's perhaps possible that blood sampling is happening in a variety of ways. There are many devices for microsampling. It continues to change on a daily basis, but it, I think, begins and ends with physicians like Dr. Irving, who advise their patients that this is maybe a path worth considering.
So Melita, you have a really interesting perspective, because obviously you bridge the research, but also, you know, you're seeing patients in clinical settings. Do you feel that they feel that there's enough information? Are they informed enough about what it would mean to take part in a clinical trial generally, and also what their options might be in terms of decentralized trials? And what that impact is on the family, you know, in terms of, because it's not just the patient, is it? It's the whole family. Do you feel there's enough information? They feel.
No, I don't think there is at the moment. I think the main problem is that there aren't. I mean, there are 10,000 rare diseases. There are not 10,000 treatments or trials. Yeah. But it's a really encouraging time at the moment, because there's a lot of focus on rare diseases, a lot of focus on how to increase the accessibility to clinical trials and innovative treatments, and how we do that is going to require all hands on deck. So I think it's time to step up and to increase what we can offer families and patients with rare diseases. And this I think really should be part of that clinical trial offering, especially if we're going to be really increasing what we do, increasing the volume of trials. They won't be accommodated at the institutions that they are currently expected to be accommodated at. So we need to think of very clever alternative solutions, and that is decentralization and mobile trial visits.
And who needs to drive that information? So if there's a lack of information, who should be driving creating those resources and getting that information out there?
Rare Revolution?
Challenge accepted.
All of us, I think. You.
All of us, I think.
Yeah.
Sponsors.
Collective responsibility, isn't it?
Yeah, collective responsibility. And I think increasingly, I keep referring to power of the patient. and power of the family. I think people should be demanding to know about alternative ways of trials being delivered, and being upskilled themselves to say, great sponsor that you are, we hear that you have this in your pipeline. We'll just would like to say, when you engage us at that very early stage, we'd like to consider alternative ways to deliver that trial, and part of that should be mobile.
And are you seeing that as a clinician? Are you seeing, because we know for sure there's a movement of more kind of professionalized patients and more informed expert patients, but are you seeing that clinically, that people are coming in and saying, I've heard about this, I want to know about this trial, you're working on this, is there more impetus coming from the patient side?
Definitely. And one thing like that I've really noticed as well is that people will say to me at the point of diagnosis, oh, well, tell me what who I should contact, who I should find out some more about this, where are the support groups? And I say, well, this is so rare that there isn't anything. And then they'll come back in a year's time and say, Melita. So if one family came back with, Melita, look at this tattoo, and they've got a tattoo on their arm. It was the tattoo that they designed for the support group that they had founded.
Amazing.
So people are being really proactive. They can use social media, they can use all sorts of different, they can use the skills that they have in their everyday lives and their occupational lives, and apply that to improving knowledge and getting together with other families, really kind of that collective power to drive agendas forward to make things better for their children.
And Stephanie, if I can come to you, how are PCM trials specifically supporting families through this process? So when they come into a trial and they're going to be engaging with mobile research nurses, how are you supporting them in that process?
Sure, absolutely. So we're primarily at the offset working with the sites and the sponsor to ensure that we are providing that information, so that conversation can happen when they're being consented, and make them aware of, okay, we understand this is a 2-year trial, but you'll only have to come to site for the year 1 and year 2 visit. Everything else can be done at home, and kind of assuaging those participant fears at the offset. We also train all of our sites on how to answer questions from participants if they're a little bit hesitant about mobile research, for all of the reasons you noted. If they are saying, well, I'm not sure I want someone coming into this safe space, how much space would I have to give this person? What is that burden looking like? We coach the sites through that, and our nurses are also coached for how to address those concerns with those participants. And so we're very adamant about communication and being very transparent about what it will look like, and making it very clear to the participants and their families that we are doing everything we can to make this as easy as possible for you. We're not looking for a lot from you in order to move this forward.
Are things like data protection and privacy and security concerns for people, obviously with files moving to the home environment and coming out of clinical settings, is that a concern for people that they ask questions about?
Absolutely. I think it's something that we do a good job of heading off. So we ensure that for PCM trials, that in the informed consent that outlines mobile visit services, that we also explicitly outline all of the data privacy information and how PCM trials will be utilizing it, so that that's all addressed at the offset and no one has to go fishing for any of that information.
Brilliant. And then by extension of that, how are the nurses, what extra training are they required to have in order to help move that process into these mobile situations? Is there unique facets that they need to cover that are a bit different that they need to be trained for?
Absolutely. So for PCM trials, we really have 2 primary buckets of training. We have one initial training when a nurse is being onboarded to PCM trials, where we train them on basics of research and GCP and things like that, and how that's adapted to a mobile setting, and how you need to be cognizant of all of those requirements in a mobile setting generally. And then before they're onboarded to any specific trial, we provide study-specific training that has been reviewed and approved by the client, to ensure that all of those visit procedures are appropriately adapted to the mobile visit setting, as well as providing a lot of education about the patient population and what you can expect when you're going into their space. As Ellen noted, with certain indications, there are people who will have different reactions to different things, and you have to be aware of those social situations to ensure that you're providing the best care possible. And so we coach all of that specific to each patient population.
And I'm interested as well whether, it's a bit more intimate, suddenly somebody being in your home. Are your nurses kind of finding that then sometimes the patients are maybe offloading or perhaps being a little bit more emotional, or, is it a different relationship than it would be if it was in a very clinical setting? Does that open them up to perhaps hearing a little bit more and being offloaded on more? And how do they manage that? Because that's an emotional thing. You're in someone's home and naturally you get into a conversation that you might not have done in a more sterile environment.
Absolutely. And I think by and large, everything that I have heard from that perspective has been that it's made our nurses feel so much more fulfilled and enriched by the experience, because to your point, some of these visits are 6-hour-long infusion visits. And while at a site, you might be set up in a room and the clinicians are going in and out and just checking on you, that clinician is with you for all 6 hours, talking to you about your experiences, about your life. And they really develop these bonds and these relationships, especially because we do our best to ensure consistent clinicians across all of these visits. So they're really building this relationship, and they become very invested in these participants' lives and their stories, and ensuring that they are getting the best care possible. It certainly does come with an emotional toll, especially for some rare diseases that may not have the desired outcomes. But by and large, everything we've heard from our nurses and the participants who have cycled feedback through the sites is that they found it incredibly enriching and fulfilling.
That kind of leads me to a sort of extension question here, which might be for both you and Melita, but does that present an opportunity or a threat perhaps in terms of capturing anecdotal information? Because, there's a lot of tears and tea time in that 6 hours in someone's home. Does that allow you to gather more anecdotal information that perhaps you wouldn't capture naturally? Or is there a risk that by hearing that off the record in those ways, somehow that's informing things as well? Like, there could be two sides to that. What are your thoughts on that?
So my thoughts are that I think it helps inform a holistic view of the participants' care, which I think is really critical. We ensure that as far as the data capture and the data quality, we're very specific in the questions and how the nurses are trained on that to ensure that none of that anecdotal evidence is being put into an EDC. But if they're aware of a participant's declining state due to how they're reporting being able to play with their children or play on a playground or something like that, but maybe they're not reporting that as a change in health during adverse events, it does enable the clinician to prompt them and say, well, you did mention that you're having a little bit more difficulty playing. Do you feel like you're decreasing in this manner or this? And so I think it helps inform a more holistic view of what the participant is really going through.
Yeah, would that be your view as well there, Melita?
Yeah, because holistic is a great way to state that, because this isn't just a trial patient. This is an actual person with a life that's impacted by all aspects of their rare disease and their family too. So my experience from undertaking video consultations is that people seem to be much more relaxed in their own homes. I have seen the same children in my hospital office and the same children in their own home on the video, and they're very different children. That when they come and see me, they might be sitting bolt upright in their chair, behaving because that's what they've been told to do, whereas in their home setting, then getting up and playing with the dog and getting a toy and coming back and coming and going, much more relaxed. And I get a much more realistic view of them when I see them in their home setting. So that must translate to the mobile research setting as well.
So would it be fair to say that that's actually got the potential to improve the quality of that data capture then?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Were you going to add something there, Ellen? Sorry.
I would, that sometimes patients' recall when they're relaxed and at home is much more complete than what they'll report. For instance, in some rare disease where there are very specific dietary exclusions or no tobacco use, or wow, is that a box of St. John's wort tablets over there? When we take in a con meds for instance, concomitant medications, it's often way more complete because we can see them on the kitchen counter. So if you're relying on recall at the site, you know, they're thinking about the 8 other things and what happened in the train station and everything else. And it's difficult for them to recall what they ate yesterday, for instance. So we find we get a different and perhaps more complete picture of what's happening in the day-to-day of that whole person.
Yeah.
And compliance as well with the procedures. I'm thinking of children who might be a bit fed up and don't want to have their blood pressure taken right now, but there's no escape for them in the hospital setting. They have to stay in the room. Maybe they could go outside the room and come back, but it's still in the hospital setting. You know, whereas if they need 5 minutes in their own home just to gather themselves and, you know, go and maybe go to their rooms and do something to cut off in their own space and get in, get them much more ready to do that procedure, that makes for much better data collection.
Yeah.
If you put it to that basic level.
Does that pose an further operational challenge, Stephanie, from a programming point of view? Because obviously something that you could kind of dictate is going to take this amount of time in clinic because the child's going to sit still and they're going to have it done, which could then become a little bit more fluid at home, suddenly becomes a 2-hour appointment. Does that, how do you factor that in?
I think that our budgets and contracts team, as well as Ellen's team, does a really great job of making sure there is a bit more buffer time in our visits to account for that. We typically see that, especially when a clinician is new to the participant or to the family, that maybe the child will get fed up 10 minutes in and say, all right, I need a break or need to play with some toys or something like that. And that can give the clinician time to relate to the caregiver or the guardian. And then as that clinician starts to come to the home over and over again and develop that relationship and cultivate that relationship with the participant, it does over time decrease the time that is being spent there. But we do certainly take into account that there is a little bit more buffer time in the home when we're contracting for services.
Yeah, thank you. Before we move on to kind of looking to the future, Melita, could you kind of sum up what you think in terms of decentralized trials and mobile research nurses and the way they are actually changing the landscape for clinical trials? Like, what's your kind of summary as to how that's all changing from someone who's seeing this on the ground?
Yeah, I think it's enabling, really. I think people who might otherwise have said, oh no, that's not for us, will now say yes. So it's really increasing the offering for patients with rare diseases. I think if 1 or 2 trials are successful, then other trials will come along, and that is to be encouraged. I think we need to really increase what we do for people with rare diseases. If we are diagnosing many more rare diseases now, we're diagnosing them much quicker. And so the focus has to be on treatments. And how do you develop treatments? It has to be through trials. So to really increase the number of trials that we're conducting and offering has to really think outside of the box. We can't keep doing it. You already said, Nicola, it's different in rare diseases. It's not the same clinical trial setup that we would expect for diabetes or much more common disorders. So in order to really increase what we do, we have to think outside of the box, and it has to be much more patient-centric and family-centric. So that must be mobile research.
And do you feel that's quite a universally held view, or are there professional people who are more reluctant? Are there investigators that think, no, the old way is better, and they're reluctant to move into this way of thinking? Or do you think actually everybody's really realizing that this is, this forms part of the future?
I think with assurance that the data that's being collected is accurate and it doesn't end up being a waste of time, then people are increasingly accepting this as part and parcel of a clinical trial methodology.
So if we look to the sort of horizon scan, start looking to the future, Ellen, what do you feel the future of clinical trial design needs to take into account or consider to continue to evolve? What's the kind of the next evolution of this?
Sure. And I think as we look to the future, I think we can point to some very recent successes in our recent past. There have been some advances made in some neurological conditions that are breathtaking. But I think it's worth noting that sponsor who did achieve an approval by FDA, we began our engagement and our work in that area through a natural history study first, and they gathered the knowledge and what they learned in that natural history study, and then a phase 1, and then a phase 2, and then into a successful phase 3 and an approval, was that right from the natural history study where they were like, let's get our hands around what this population is looking like and what are the endpoints going to be. Let's think intelligently about what are the endpoints, primary and secondary, that you're going after. Secondly, think deeply and deeply look into that SOE so that it is attainable, achievable, and a patient and their carers are going to be encouraged to stick with it all the way through. There were some of those little girls that stuck with that through all the way through the journey.
Fantastic.
It's progressive, accretive knowledge, and start early and look at that SOE. And again, if you can maintain that family's routine, they're going to be loyal and stick with it because they will not be majorly disrupted in their pursuit of happiness, whatever that looks like. So it's accretive knowledge and applying the lessons of the past. Reach out to consultants and experts, not unlike ourselves. Ask us what we've seen that worked. We'll also share with you what was not so successful or proved to be burdensome. We have a lot of knowledge now, 20 years in our industry. We're eager to use it.
I guess that's as important, isn't it? When we're looking at lessons learned, what didn't work is as important as understanding what did work, so we can avoid the pitfalls in the future. So I think it's clear from what you've said already, Melita, that you definitely think that this is part of the future and that there will be a lasting legacy of this type of model. So let's talk about the importance of patient engagement. So, how do we get the design right? And I think, you started, Ellen, by saying the importance of understanding people's routines and what's important to them. But, how important is it to capture that, and how do we do that? So how can somebody start capturing that information to make sure that every trial design really does have the patient at the center, and that filters through to this application of the mobile nursing? But probably Melita might be one for you to start with.
Well, I think, I think that is really important to capture the whole view. Strictly speaking, for clinical trials, the things that we capture are scientific. Because they have to be reproducible, they have to be statistically analyzed. So much of the kind of softer real world type information doesn't always make it into a clinical trial design. I think it could do on 2 levels though. One, we collect quite a lot of patient reported outcome measures. So how are the patients and their families feeling about the intervention? What things changed since the last visit? Do they experience less pain? Can they do things now that they couldn't do before? And I think that is probably best assessed in the home environment, as opposed to sitting in a hospital room trying to remember if they tied their shoelaces up properly yesterday. So just doing things in the home environment, I think, will probably help capture more accurately some of those PROM elements. And then also at the point of approvals for drugs to be approved, capturing that additional evidence around the effects of an intervention on a child and on their family that might not be captured through the protocol is really important in persuading regulators that this drug should be approved if indeed it is successful. So it helps with convincing regulators and convincing payers as well that there is a benefit that might be outside of the primary endpoint itself. Yeah.
Was there something you wanted to add to that, Ellen?
Simply to say that, again, it's an investment that others are making in a future, and a practical future. And we agree, definitely, Dr. Irving, with your assessment that it needs to make sense to the payer. And the ability to climb off and on the school bus is huge. And maybe that's more effective measure than a 6-minute walk test, where everyone in that hallway is under so much stress. You can almost taste it, you can smell it. But that young one being able to walk down the front stairs, down the driveway, and climb on a school bus is everything we want to see.
Yeah.
There needs to be some give and take for what regulators are looking for. And again, I refer back to endpoints.
Mhm.
I think we're maybe beginning to see a shifting now in what is an endpoint, and let's really deeply look at what are we hoping that the outcome is going to be, and what does success look like. So
Do you
we
think that this
welcome and
model
encourage
helps
it.
to do that shift? Because I think, we're all starting to understand that, the endpoints do mean different things for different people. And do you think that this model will help drive that shift to looking at some of these more softer endpoints and moving away from regimented clinical endpoints?
I do, because here in the United States, certainly CMS, which is the official government, this is how we're going to get things paid for under Medicare, Medicaid, Department of Defense, big spenders in healthcare. I think they are opening their minds to what the outcome is of a successful run at this.
Mhm.
And we saw that in the CMS utterances on April 7th of 2022 about a certain drug in the Alzheimer's space.
Yeah.
That, they were questioning, show me efficacy and effectiveness from your earliest trial. Don't wait for your phase 3 to bring that to me. Bring it to me as early in the process as possible.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to see that translate into rare and ultra rare disease as well. That again, maybe the 6-minute walk test isn't the be all end all of accomplishment, or as an exclusion inclusion benchmark. Maybe it's going to be climbing on the school bus, or climbing up a slide on the playground. We might have to see a softening in what the payer is looking for, because as much as we don't like it to be true, their voice is an important one.
Yeah. And I think that alone is an important legacy of this change, isn't it? Aside from all of the other benefits of this type of model, from a patient perspective, to be able to have some of those different endpoints to be validated and to be considered as important, because really from a patient perspective, those are the things that matter. Can I iron? Can I do this? Can I get on the school bus? Those are actually the things that matter. So to be able to have a shift towards that, that is game changing for patients, and then the potential of what that means in the approvals process. So it's that alone is a wonderful legacy. I just want to come back to you, Stephanie, just to kind of round up on this. So in terms of getting feedback from participants on the experience of taking part in the trials and the experience of the remote nursing, how do you capture that, and how does that feed back into this process of evolving and developing for the future?
So it's an excellent question, and something we're constantly working through because we are primarily working with the sites and our nurses. PCM Trials is not producing anything that in the United States would be IRB reviewed or approved, or EC reviewed or approved, because we don't want to add to that timeline. So we primarily rely on the sites to interact with their participants about what that feedback is, as well as the participant with the nurse, so that we can drive continuous improvement and ensure that we are designing our services to best fit those participants. It's something that we're trying to see how we can get all of that information from the participant while keeping those data privacy and considerations related to reviewing what needs to go through review processes.
Wonderful, thank you. We've actually had a question just come in off the back of what you were saying there, Ellen, saying great to see that the 6-minute walk test is not always applicable, or even maybe an out-of-date process now. So I think everyone's aligned on that.
We're hoping that we will see the day. It's the number one reason we might have to disqualify ourselves from serving a trial in a more complete way. And certainly, it's just such a stressful thing for the littles and their parents.
Yeah.
There's so much on the line. And, if you or I were asked to perform a rote specific task at a specific time in an unfamiliar place with unfamiliar people, clearly everyone just a little bit anxious, would any of us perform at our best? So we do see that littles, I think some of our best outcomes come when there are Legos on the floor and nurses on the floor and little ones on the floor. I think everyone's in their happy place.
Yeah. And I think that's a really lovely image to end on, isn't it? You know, that really is a massive mind shift from what people think of as a clinical trial and participation in research to then actually think of it in that context. That's a really lovely way to end on that, Ellen. We have got some questions that have been submitted by our audience in advance. I'm just going to go straight to these, but just to say to anyone else that's listening, if you have got more questions, please do pop them into the chat. So the first question we've had here, which might be possibly for Ellen or Stephanie to answer, is how do I begin considering a mobile research nurse in my trial design? So what's that first step?
What's the first step is to reach out what we need in order to discern. And I rely heavily on Stephanie and her team of experts at adapting protocols from the site to the kitchen table. We like to take in a protocol, get a look at that SOE, show me some a nice big N of safety data if we're going to be administering IMP in the home, always helpful for us. A lab manual, so we know exactly what it is as far as the needs for processing, and the level of interest and commitment. Mm-hmm. You know, we do take our time. We say no about 1/3 of the time.
Interesting. So it's not a suitable for everybody in all cases.
Yeah. Or undignified to perform in the home. And you know, that's a piece of this too, is human dignity. We are in the intimate space of a home. Yeah. So it's interesting. I probably review 30 protocols a week. And some of them I'm seeing more and more of them are written intelligently and with DCT, decentralized trials in mind, where before it was 1 in 20. Now it's most of them acknowledge that people have lives.
So the next question we've got here is, how can I find out if a mobile research nurse is vital for my specific trial? So I guess that's, how do you work out if it is the right approach? And maybe this is down to at what point somebody would engage with somebody like yourself as well. How does somebody, is it right at the start of thinking about the project, or what's the timing, and how do you really make sure if it is the right process for your trial?
I think Stephanie would agree with me. It's never too early. Even if a trial is a twinkle in your eye and you're planning that natural history study, it's worth having a chat. We take a look at a lot of protocol synopses, which is not a formally signed off on formalized final protocol. But of course, by the time we get midway through a trial, I'm sure Dr. Irving will agree, we're looking at protocol amendment 5, 6, 7, you know, it's research, it's science, it's constantly evolving. So it's never too early to engage, and we can lay out what is typically done, or these are the standard activities. And if you have a special need or request, then I call on Stephanie. So I guess, Stephanie, what's an example of something that we say, thank you, but no thank you, or we don't think it's fit for purpose in our recent past?
Sure. So one example that comes to mind is for infants, infants in respiratory distress during an unscheduled illness event, where we would need to be auscultating the abdomen to ensure the appropriate breath sounds. That's something that we don't feel is consistent across mobile research clinicians, and we would want them to go back to a clinician who had seen that participant in their healthy state to know the healthy baseline versus what we're looking at for an illness endpoint. That's something where we've said, you know, we would love to support this as much as we can, but we don't feel confident in the quality of the data that we would be providing if we just had a clinician looking at that data point. We are happy to tell you when we feel we are out of our depth and that we think it is not something that is practical to be done in the home. But I cannot echo Ellen's point enough that if you are even considering DCT, to have a conversation about how we can adapt it, it is not only a great way to structure a protocol at the outset, but it also saves everyone a lot of time and money, because if you have to go through an additional review cycle or amendments down the line to add in things that could have been added in at the outset, it's only going to prolong your timelines and prolong care for those participants.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think we've come to the end of all of the questions, but I would say that if anyone's got a question that they think of after this session, we are going to have some contact details up at the end on a slide. So please do reach out and get in touch if you want to have any follow-up questions. So I would just like to say a huge thanks. I think we can all agree that's been a really informative session. I've certainly learned a lot there. And I think the imagery that has been conjured up by the way you've all described that is really shifted my mind, certainly about what we expect and traditionally think of as clinical trials. So I think it's a really exciting thing to see has got such traction. I'm really excited to see where it goes in the future. So I really appreciate you all giving your insights, and thank you so much. Thank you also to our audience for tuning in and listening and bringing us your really insightful questions. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. Please do feel free, as I said, to reach out if you've got any questions using the contacts on the screen, or you can come to Becky or any of our team and we can field those forward. Lastly, just to say that the full session will be available on demand later in the month so that you can revisit, recatch up, or dial into any of the particular elements that you'd like to revisit. So thank you all very much, and I appreciate your time, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care. Thanks. Bye.